Alright, first of all, there will be sorry for today. Second of all, good morning. Welcome to round 4 of the Cambodia UADC 2017. Before we start, Jerry will introduce himself as well as give their preferred gender pronoun. My name is Isa from Malaysia. My preferred gender pronoun is he or they. On my left, we have Selena, whose preferred gender pronoun is she. And on my right, we have Ari, whose preferred gender pronoun is. Right. So we start in debate, I'll open the floor to any declarations of preferred gender pronouns.
I'm Mr. Here.
No preference. As in he.
Like he or they.
Okay. With that being said, like I invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
When international aid comes into, or international organizations go into countries which need that particular developmental aid, it's very rare that that particular development aid or the infrastructure in which they place in ends up becoming sustainable. I mean, that a lot of times when they come in real quick, they also leave real quick, and it leads to a lot of undeveloped, and it leads to a lot of things that need to be developed but aren't necessarily being attended to by these international bodies, and that's what we'll be talking about in this debate. There are two objectives coming from government bench. It's first that we want to ensure sustainability of development within these particular nations, and second, we think that it's good for us to have a certain level of independence in which these nations will be able to learn to sustain themselves and not be dependent on international organizations. And we think that's better achieved in our world. Before moving on to the two issues of sustainability and independence, several clarifications and categorizations that we would like to present to the floor. First is, what is developmental aid and what does it necessarily look like? We think that aside from like infrastructure and roads and schools and hospitals, we think that it also means food chain supplies or connections in which you can bring in food to these nations, and you build this, and you generally build a standard of living which can cultivate a sustainable environment in order for investors to be attracted to that country, or also an environment in which the individual or the people who live in that country can sustain themselves as well. I mean, this is an objective of development aid that international bodies has failed to achieve. What type of international bodies are we talking about? We think that it would necessarily be like UN bodies, for example, the UNDP, the UN Development Program, or in terms of education, for example, UNICEF, right? And we say that UNICEF. So the trade-off that government bench would probably be making in this debate is we agree that in terms of capacity and expertise, or in terms of efficiency, the development in our world will probably be slow because you don't have those particular skill sets in order to achieve that. However, we think that it's going to be out of motion that the amount of money that you get will probably be similar because you're directly taking it away from the international organizations and putting them into the local NGOs. And we think that we're fine with the lack of capacity or efficiency because then eventually we'll lead there, and we think that eventually leading there brings to a more sustainable long-term benefit and long-term outcome, right? So the type of countries that we also are talking about, you have to understand, is usually they need this development aid. It's not necessarily because they're under like famine or poverty, which leads to people not having food at all. We think that is more to a humanitarian crisis, and that's not part of this debate. However, we think it's more towards countries which has a slow growth curve in terms of their economy, and their economy is not necessarily flourishing. Probably countries like Philippines or Cambodia, right? Cambodia or Myanmar. We think that oftentimes these countries are in this position because they're relatively new democracies, or they've just gotten out of colonialism, and they haven't had the economic boom which puts them at the same level as other countries. That's why they need this particular help. However, the individuals on the ground are able to still sustain themselves in terms of getting food and surviving, even when their economy is not necessarily thriving. So let's talk about the first issue, the sustainability. In order for us to understand this issue, we have to understand the interests of these two different groups, the international bodies and the local NGOs. What do the international bodies want? We think that first of all, we think that they want to be quick, they want to be fast and quick, right? Because they have reputation to uphold. Because in order for them to be able to go into other countries, they have to prove to some extent that they are able to bring a quick form of development, right? So that what happens is that it makes them tend to cater or focus on only certain areas, for example, the capitals, right? And not spread it out, because the spreading out of that particular development will make that development slower, right? And it won't reach it as fast as they would want to, because they will also have to satisfy their donors as well. But second of all, we think that they also have a lot of countries in which they have to cater to, because there's international bodies and they have a lot of countries under their wing. It's not specific only that they will want to protect one particular country. This means that their KPI would then be how many countries can we give development aid to, or how many countries can we help in building infrastructure really quick, right? So that's why we think that it would be so that's why we think that their focus would be the true development of the people on the ground. I think that those are the main stakeholders in this debate. Third of all, is that we think that their interest would be with the government, right? Because in order for these international bodies to come in, a lot of times they have to be chummy with the government, and this would lead to a lot of focusing on the areas in which the government operates, for example, the capitals, and in a lot of times we have to pander to their interests, which isn't necessarily towards the development of rural areas, because the members of the government, no thank you, who want to have things better in where they are. But let's compare that to the interests of the local NGOs. Right? I think that local NGOs are more likely to want to support the local community in terms of even beyond infrastructure, right? In terms of giving education, in terms of giving them advices or things that they need to know in order for them to be able to be absorbed into this new economy, or in order for them to adapt to this new infrastructure which is put in place. I think that the reasons why is that first, they have a more personal touch to the people on the ground, because these are often areas in which the members of those local NGOs have grown up in, or those are their own villages. And the people around them are often people that they are familiar with, and they have that personal connection in wanting to really develop them as human beings, right? So that's why that's the interest of the NGOs. But what are the harms of the interests of these international bodies being as such in comparison to the local NGOs? Now, first, we think that a lot of times the infrastructure in which international bodies put in end up being unmaintained. Right? Because a lot of times the individuals on the ground don't necessarily know how to maintain them, or second, don't necessarily have the expertise to create or to garner those resources in order to maintain this particular hub. So the comparison is that in the long run, even though when you have amazing infrastructure in these particular countries, that in the long run they tend to deteriorate and they tend to break down, and you don't have individuals who are able to sustain them as well. So second is regarding the independence. We think that a lot of times when, even if opposition wants to say that, well, wait, these people can work with these international bodies, right? But oftentimes they're only put into lower positions, and they don't end up knowing how to become the management part of these bodies into helping or into managing these resources as well. We think that even if they mess up in the start, right? We think that they will be able to learn from that, and it creates a longer sustainable, it's already says, longer sustainable environment as well. We think that also in a lot of times when you have a lot of infrastructure, you don't necessarily have the people or the individuals who are fill in this infrastructure. For example, if you have hospitals and schools, you don't necessarily have the education of people being teachers or doctors. That takes a much longer amount of time, something that international bodies cannot wait for. And we think that for all those reasons, it's more difficult for us to divert the development aid to local NGOs.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Now we will kick off the case from the opposition, and I invite the leader of opposition.
Alright, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So first off, I'll start with some quick rebuttals. So what we got from side proposition were these. So one, sustainability of development, that is when aid is given to these countries via local NGOs, there exists a certain amount of sustainability that is attached to it in terms of the fact that these people look to create a certain sense of development over a longer period of time, and two, that if a consultation does exist, that is between a local NGO and between an international organization, then what occurs is that even in a best case scenario, that would not be possible. But for that, I'd like to start off with my constructive. So first, we talk about disruption of aid. That is in a scenario and in a case where the aid that these international organizations would be diverting to these local NGOs would never reach these local NGOs. What we're essentially doing is creating an increased channel. We're increasing the number of channels and therefore disrupting the very process that leads to this aid reaching these local NGOs. So now, as a result, what occurs is that by increasing the number of channels, we are increasing the essential and the potential risk of this aid reaching into the wrong hands. So, constructive number two, we go on to explain to you why, even if the aid reaches these local NGOs, we need to understand what kind of zones these are. So, we need to understand that most countries and regions that require local aid, that require humanitarian aid, are essentially conflict-stricken zones. So, therefore, there exists absolutely no framework. There exists absolutely no framework for these organizations to carry out these distribution processes. So, with the lack of an existing framework and with the lack of organization within these local NGOs, it becomes extremely difficult for the distribution process to be organized. Constructive number three, regulation and enforcement versus guidance and capacity building. So, what that essentially means is that when these organizations, these international organizations would essentially aggressively divert this aid to local organizations for the distribution process within concentration on the regulation and enforcement as compared to capacity building. So what happens is that these organizations, in order to make sure that the aid reaches the right hands, international organizations divert more of their attention to make sure that these local organizations and these local NGOs partake and participate in the process of making this aid reach the right hands. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, this is a process of transferring risk. These international organizations are well equipped. They have military backing, they have the necessary resources, and they have the necessary frameworks to carry out these processes and to carry out these distribution processes to these countries. So, within the absence of that, in the absence of these existing frameworks, these local NGOs find it extremely difficult to carry out these distribution processes, and therefore it is essential to understand that these international organizations in consultation with these local NGOs is possibly the most beneficial model. Now, side proposition came and talked to us about how NGOs have a personal touch and how NGOs essentially have a certain lack of expertise, but in the case wherein an international organization would help out these local NGOs, there would be an absence of capacity building. Ladies and gentlemen, we come and tell you that a local NGO, when working in consultation and working hand in hand with an international organization, that does not occur because of the fact that existing frameworks within the international organizations make sure that local NGOs essentially carry out the process. So, with military backing. So, I'll give you an example. Now, there have been situations, and there have been multiple situations wherein the international aid was diverted through local organizations and local NGOs to reach the people, but they were massive failures. But there have been several successes in the case wherein international organizations have partaken in the process, and without any support of local NGOs, they have managed to do this. The UNOCI, the AMSISOM, and the UNAMA. 3 cases wherein international aid was provided to conflict-stricken zones without any help from local NGOs and managed to do the job brilliantly. What occurs is that many a time local NGOs do not have the existing equipment, do not have the existing frameworks to carry out these processes, and therefore find it extremely difficult to make sure that the aid reaches the right hands. Yes, any clarification?
Since that the international bodies globally have to keep, in your when will those local NGOs finally have that framework?
Yes, exactly. So in our model, we propose to you a situation wherein international NGOs work in collaboration with local NGOs. So it is not as though local NGOs are completely cut off from the entire process. We come and tell you that local NGOs work in collaboration with the international organizations, learn about the existing frameworks, potentially gain from the military backing that these international organizations have, and therefore increase their capacity and their ability to carry out distributive processes later on when these international organizations do leave. All right. So coming to my first constructive disruption of aid. Ladies and gentlemen, it is extremely important that to understand that by increasing the channels, one essentially increases the risk of the aid not reaching the local NGOs in the very first place. Now, there is a massive possibility of the aid not reaching the hands of the local NGOs and therefore reaching the wrong hands, which essentially carries out or which essentially results in terror organizations and essentially a massive chance that it will essentially fall into the wrong hands. Number two, conflict-stricken zones. So with the lack of an existing framework in these countries are already conflict-stricken. They do not have any form of infrastructure, and therefore these local NGOs would not be well equipped to carry out the entire process. And therefore, completing the obligation on the ground is something that is not a guarantee. It's something that cannot be guaranteed by these local NGOs because they're not in a condition to do so. They do not have the necessary equipment. They do not have the necessary framework or the infrastructure to carry out these distributive processes. And guidance and capacity building. So in your model, you talk about how local NGOs would essentially never benefit when international organizations do essentially carry out these processes. But we come and tell you that international organizations will help these local NGOs in understanding the nitty-gritties, in understanding the intricacies that are involved in the entire process of distributing this. And therefore, in the longer run, aid not only reaches the hands of those who require it, local NGOs do benefit, and the international organizations therefore successfully carry out these aid operations. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud of those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. To extend this case to the government bench, I gladly invite
We believe that local NGOs have the capacity to do so many wonderful things and so many great things, it's just that they don't have the resources. For their case of having international NGOs work with local NGOs, it's pretty like a pretty soft case at the end of the day, because when that happens, that still means that international NGOs get probably 90%, 80% of the development aid from USA or the West or whatever, and they probably still control what development goes on. When we give a lot more control, a lot more agency to local NGOs to decide how to develop their country, we believe that is when we will achieve a lot more benefits, right? But let's look at their case, because they seem to want to run on a really, really worst case scenario of or a terrible world where all these local NGOs are very likely to be corrupt or very likely to fall into the wrong hands, for example, right? This is that case. So let's actually debate where the majority of local NGOs are actually not in the wrong hands, for example. These are also like very like good NGOs. But even if you want to introduce a like independent body that checks on these local NGOs, we're perfectly fine with that, and that's perfectly available to be done, right? But secondly, they want to talk about distribution. This would be largely dealt with in my case. But understand this: we are perfectly willing to like trade off efficient distribution when it, to then gain like like localized and very focused distribution in like local communities, for example, right? These huge international agencies, they only see development as a big picture kind of thing. Like they need highways, they need roads, they need like these big picture things, right? Yes, in many cases, that is what a lot of these countries need. But we believe that a lot of these different countries have different intricacies that need to be also dealt with. So there are two issues in this debate about which side is more sustainable, and secondly, which side will get rid of the culture of dependency. And I believe that this is something that side government didn't really tackle on, and they want to tackle on like very feasible issues. So let's think about sustainability. So why is sustainability important? Because let's say like in the best case scenario of international agencies, they develop cities really, really quickly. They build highways, they build roads, and they build like hospitals and schools. But the problem is, there is no analysis as to why this will continue to be maintained or will continue to remain in good conditions, right? That means in 10, 15 years, these schools and these infrastructure will most likely be obsolete or be very, very badly maintained. You have terrible roads, you have terrible highways, and etc., right? And also, you have to also live in a world where how like in this day and age, a very globalized day and age, development and growth of countries happen really, really quickly, in the sense that population growth happens really, really quickly, right? So development aid from international agencies that built highways or whatever 10 years ago cannot compensate for the huge growth of many, many different countries, right? So it's most likely that this development aid will only help one generation, and in 10, 15 years, the next generation will not be able to use these kind of facilities and this kind of development aid in a really, really good way that benefits them at the end of the day, right? So many of these benefits will only usually help the current generation. But secondly, even if they build like huge, let's say like networking or like it connects small cities to like larger cities, for example, it still doesn't tackle the issue of like really, really, really poor communities, right? Like extreme poverty. Because you can see in many mega cities, for example, in like Dhaka, for example, that there are major cities. A lot of people come to these mega cities, but there are also like millions of still poor people that remain around the cities and also remain in the cities. These are the things that they do not cater to, because we do not want like development to like be just like huge GDP growth, for example, or huge economic growth without actually lifting up all aspects of society, right? So we believe that when you only focus on like huge big picture projects, that is when you are more likely to like trade off a lot of really poor communities at the end of the day. This is extremely important, because if these international agencies want what's best for the country, they can only think about what's best for the country right now, right? They have to think about what's best for the country when the country changes governments, for example, or changes like presidents, or like what happens in 10, 15 years when the growth will increase by tenfold, right? These are the things that they have to think about. And they also have to think about the fact that a lot of these local communities have different like needs, right? So which leads me to my second issue about dependency. So we see this in a lot of places, and this is something that's undeniable in its fact. A lot of countries in Africa, like when they are very dependent on international aid, it's very unlikely that local communities and local economies grow, right? They aren't able to build local businesses, for example. They aren't able to have thriving entrepreneurs to be self-dependent, for example. A lot of these people are very dependent on international agencies that a lot of local NGOs also are destroyed. Sit down. So what is it that these local NGOs do? We can see that a lot of local NGOs are built by, like the people from the neighborhood are like the citizens from that country. It literally means that, for example, maybe my neighborhood has a problem of my school. My school doesn't have enough teachers or doesn't have enough competent teachers. Because of that, I feel very close to that issue. I go out and start a local NGO to tackle this one initiative specifically, right? I want to tackle the fact that I need more teachers. So I build local NGOs to help local schools starting up around my neighborhood, or even like around my city, for example, to like have better schools and have better teachers in this area. Or it can even be like farming or crops, right? They believe that a lot of the farmers, they need loans or need better development for their farm. This is the main source of the economy for my city. This is where like these local NGOs tackle all of these necessary specific needs of these communities, right? So they build based on necessity, and this is really important because it is a general necessity. Not everybody needs roads to connect the cities. Like local farms, they're perfectly happy to live within the local farms, but they just need to develop these things, and they don't have access or they don't have capacity to do so. And this exists like with a multitude of NGOs. There are millions of NGOs out there that help very specific issues. Before 6, go ahead, you want?
Yes. So in the case where you stated that all these things are done by the local NGOs, I fail to understand how an international organization has not got a sustainable development model as opposed to your model.
We just said like they think of big picture projects, right? So it literally means that they don't think of maintaining the project within 10, 15 years, for example. But if the local NGO literally stays there, they see that this project needs maintenance, they see that this project needs to grow, for example, and this is why like close proximity and living there actually helps them. But secondly, under dependency is that they build inter-networking communities. This is extremely important. So they build local economies. So imagine like a local NGO, they will literally help this one like mom and pop shop to like build. And that mom and pop shop will like continuously grow other entrepreneurs around the area. So they would have a national incentive to want to build like, I don't know, the people from my city's economies as well, because we are like interdependent with each other. This is when local economies are inter-networking and they can locally develop like together, right? And this is extremely important because then they can be self-dependent. They don't have to be dependent on a larger source or like a larger international agencies development. And secondly, they also hire locals, and this is extremely important because like international agencies, when they build, even if they build better economies and build better businesses, it's no saying that they will hire locals, right? Local NGOs want to hire locals, they want to develop their locals, they want to train these locals to in the future build their own businesses, for example, and become their own entrepreneurs, for example. These are all things that are very pertinent to a country, and these are the things that need to be tackled by these NGOs. For all those reasons, we brought this.
Thank you very much. Now let me invite the leader of this please the option.
Right, so we on side opposition feel like government is very conveniently characterized the debate by nitpicking on very pragmatic situations. And I'm going to talk about this through the course of rebuttals as well as constructors. I'll take the rebuttals first. Now, we believe that sustainability is an important factor as well. We believe that sustainability is important for a nation that's coming out of conflict, for a nation that is developing to have. But we believe that the right form to attain this sustainability is not by handing down large amount of finances to local NGOs that are incapable of distributing them. Rather than that, we suggest that we give it to international organizations that can work in collaboration with local NGOs. And the reason we want to drive this point home is this. We talked about how the premise of our debate is this, that in a war-torn conflict situation, or even in a much better situation where there is no conflict, there aren't proper mechanisms and structures into place. There aren't institutions and regulating mechanisms into place. There aren't laws governing NGOs. And there isn't any defined model under which these NGOs can function. What international organizations bring into perspective is a much larger, more organized framework under which these NGOs can operate. These NGOs then leverage the level of expertise that these international organizations have, gain this expertise over the years, and finally, when these international organizations leave the country, the local NGOs do have the power to run these organizations, therefore creating quick, self-sustaining models. Government is willing to make a trade-off with resources being lost and leakages being made in the system in exchange for sustainability. We tell you under our model, you do not need to make that trade-off. We tell you that under our model, what happens is that these local NGOs are equipped to deal with these institutions and run them more efficiently with the expertise they get from the international organizations, thereby giving more sustainability, thereby also leveraging the expertise of these international organizations. Major point we'd like to make is this, that why are international organizations much better than NGOs at development? We tell you this, that all the local NGOs have a more grassroots reach. By working with them, international organizations can leverage this grassroots reach of them. We also tell you this, that the technological expertise of these international agencies and the panel of experts that they have to actually solve problems in economics, in poverty, in development is something that these local NGOs do not have. It's something that they do not possess, and because of which they simply cannot fix a lot of problems in these nations. Government also talks about how international organizations have a very tunnel vision when it comes to development. We tell you this is essentially not the correct thing. We tell you because when my leader of opposition comes here and talks about the accountability factor, it's very important to consider that NGOs in a country where there is no framework or structure are not accountable to anyone. They do not get audited. We do not even know if the resources reach the aggrieved parties. Whereas an international organization is bound by international law, is bound by a specific framework and mechanism to prove that the resources that have been dished out have actually gone to the aggrieved party, and they have to show mapped outcomes in considerable development, which local NGOs fail throughout. Let's also talk about how leader opposition comes and tells us that the international organization infrastructure is not protected. I would like to talk about how the United Nations mission in Ivory Coast, UNOCI, and the United Nations mission in Somalia, Amazon. These were two missions that had large amounts of development aid coming in through the international body, which is the United Nations. What they did was they set up hospitals which still exist, while all other locally built hospitals have been run down. We tell you why. We tell you because there is a large amount of protection that an international body brings in with these organizations. Even when these organizations leave the country, the localites, even the terrorists, even the dissenters, even those who want to burn it down, realize that there is more benefit from this institution than there is harm, and therefore they keep it going. Local NGOs keep it running, and these institutions have continued to exist till date. Let's also talk about the characterization of debate from their side when they talk about dependency. When they talk about how local NGOs have less dependency and because of which they have more room to exercise their will, we tell you this is absolutely wrong on their part, and we tell you why. We tell you this because local NGOs are more bound to changing frameworks and changing laws because of the fact that they have different governments in their countries. Their governments keep changing. The regulatory act on NGOs keep changing. Like it has changed in India, 100 NGOs got banned. So we tell you international organizations are immune from this. We tell you international organizations are bound by a framework that all countries have like ratified and been a part of, because of which it is a foolproof system and a much more efficient way to deploy resources. In a minute. My leader of opposition comes and talks about the fear of non-deliverance and disruption of this aid. What we mean by this is that aid can simply fall into the wrong hands, not by any fault of the local NGO. The local NGO does not have to be corrupt for this. We tell you that in Somalia, when local NGOs were distributing aid at the ports, the militia would come and they would take over that aid, and therefore there was no military backing that the local NGOs had to actually protect the aid. We tell you, as a direct consequence of this, you are transferring risk from the international body, which is equipped and capable of dealing with hostile situations like this, to a local NGO which is not capable of dealing with harsh situations like this, and thereby using large amounts of aid, finance, and a lot of other capital. Before I move on to my next point, any Okay, so I'll tell you what is the incentive for international organizations to work for this. International organizations have been instituted of development within these regions. They have bound to be is much weaker. So to summarize what we talked about how we need to talk about why. We need to talk about why international organizations are much better at dispensing these resources than local NGOs. We told you how there is non-deliverance on aid on the part of NGOs, even in the best case where there is no conflict. We told you how aid can fall into the wrong hands. It could also fall into the hands of local militia armed terrorists like they did in Somalia, which could lead to a more, which could lead to gun battles, which could lead to violence and actually increase the problem in the situation. We tell you that international organizations are doing their job well so far. International organizations have done a great job. Are we actually creating a problem where a problem doesn't exist? And we also provided remedial actions by talking about how NGOs can work with us and therefore provide long-term sustainability alongside leveraging the expertise and amount of excessive funds that international organizations have. With all these points in place, proud to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of Opposition. To summarize the successful portion of the government bench and by the government initiative.
Fast doesn't necessarily mean good. We all know that. What we from side government is trying to say is that which side, whether with international community or international organization directly plays in hand, managing, calling shots in the development aid, or with NGOs calling that shots, will make a better development. Yes, we concede to the fact that we might not be as efficient as international organization. Yes, we might not be as fast as international organization, but we are not here to think about the short term. Yes, they might have more hospitals in 5 years. We might have one, they might have 5. But in 20 years, our one hospital can be managed properly and can cater to a lot more individuals compared to their 5, in which will most likely run down all 5 of them. And I'm going to tell you why. But before that, they've never really argued. They've never really engaged with our argument on dependency and why dependency is bad. Because let's look at Somalia. Yes, they got international aid from United Nations, from other international communities, but were they able to sustain such thing, and were they able to live after that? We see they are still dependent on United Nations. A lot of African countries are still dependent on United Nations because their NGOs don't get a hand in calling shots, don't get a hand in those resources in order to develop themselves, and we think that's the heart. They've never engaged throughout the first two speakers, and we think that argument still stands and it's important. I'm going to argue that a little bit more later on. But first, the two issues is sustainability and dependency. And let's look at sustainability because that's what they wanted to argue a lot on. Because they wanted to argue that, look, we don't create sustainability because number one, resource won't ever reach the NGOs because most of these countries are conflict zone countries or they are simply bounded by law. You need to understand that number one, if you want to argue that resources don't necessarily reach to the NGOs or doesn't necessarily reach to the people on the ground, it still happens with international organizations. Let us look at what's currently happening at Syria. Not all aids, for example, like the foods and resources that you want to argue reach to the people on the ground. Terrorizing still happens within international community. What we can say is that we don't want international organization to manage those things, but we can still have international organizations such as the United Nations Blue Helmets to safeguard those resources in which it will still reach to the individual. But also, if you want to talk about law, they still need to abide the laws, etc., because they are in the country. I'm sorry, international organization coming into your country and wanting to give development aid and develop your country are still bounded by those laws. What we argue to you is how, even if that we are not efficient, we are going to create more sustainable development in the future. Second thing that they wanted to argue in sustainability is because you won't have the sustainability. Because you lack framework. Because they can. Because NGOs don't have much skills, resources, etc. Number one, we beg to differ. A lot of NGOs within these countries, such as the Philippines, such as Cambodia, and all other countries, these NGOs actually do have skills, actually do have manpower. The problem is they have limitation with resources because they don't get resources from other people who are more able. Once you take resources from international organizations and direct it aggressively to NGOs, that's when they have more resources. That's when they can buy more drugs in order for them to dispense all this development aid you want to talk about. That's when NGOs in Cambodia, NGOs in rural areas in Malaysia can buy more drugs so that they can have moving libraries or moving schools to develop their own places. Unlike your side, what will happen is that international communities will be more likely to only develop a specific area because they have they need to focus on different things. They have to focus on Cambodia. They have to focus on Somalia. They have to focus on different other communities. That means they cannot direct all their attention to one place compared to NGOs where they can fully put on all their manpower in developing that area. Sit down. Not accepted. Okay, and then they told us that what we can do is that we can have international organizations work with NGOs. Three responses to this. Number one, what you do here is that international organizations still manages those resources, and that's what we are against. Because what happens then is that international organizations are the one who's holding the higher up positions. The skills that you want to talk about are not going to be distributed towards local NGOs. It means they will still call shots, and when they call shots, it means they need to prioritize. International organizations are less likely to make a decision based on what the community wants and what the community really needs, compared to showing that hey, we have development aid. But second response to this, that we can also have guidance because they can still connect with international organizations. But what we are doing differently is that NGOs are the ones who's calling shots. Yes, international organizations can give advice, but still the decision making will be made by NGOs. But last response to this, that even if you say that these people can take charge afterwards, we believe afterwards means that you're not giving them resources. You show everything to them. They don't have this resource to manage all these things that you want to target. What happens when international community goes up? Under their paradigm, they have buildings, they have roads, but people don't know how to manage it properly because you're not giving them the resources in order for them to develop themselves. But under our side, NGOs will still be there and they can manage that. Before going to 6, yes, any one of you? Yeah.
So you spoke about the Somali and also African countries that rely on the United Nations. But isn't this reliance simply because of the failure of global NGOs? For example, in the cases of Cote d'Ivoire, where the UN actually did
Yes, exactly. Because UN were the one managing those resources, the development aid. The NGOs don't have any say, and resources don't go to them. Once you give resources to them, that's when they can expand. That's when they can increase their capability, so that they will decrease their dependency towards the international community. Lastly, dependency, because this is what they've never really engaged, and this is important throughout my first two speakers. Because you need to understand that these local communities, they don't really need international connection. What they need is the local intra-connection. What happens when international organization comes in is that it's most likely going to center this development into one aspect only. Whereas if you have local NGOs, that's when local NGOs managing those resources, that's when local NGOs are more likely to connect with other NGOs, creating a connection. That's when you create more, you cut off dependency from international community, because now they realize they can do everything on their own rather than having United Nations on the ground. From our side, we say, yes, we're a bit slow, but we're good on our own.
Thank you very much, Government Whip, to summarize the stand portion of the event, and by Government Whip here.
Thank you, sir. There seems to have been some sort of misconception about what international organizations are. I'm sure you all know, but we remind you. International organizations consist of the member states that require this help themselves. So when you have an international organization come in, it is not a foreign body, or it is not one country that is going ahead and doing this. It is the Blue Helmets, or it is the Red Cross, or it is the World Health Organization that consists of soldiers or people from the armies and the navies and the air forces of the country, of the host country itself, ladies and gentlemen. So you do have a grassroots connection simply because you work with local governments and you work with local armies that are in fact part of the Blue Helmets, ladies and gentlemen. That is a key point that side proposition seem to ignore throughout their arguments, so in order to gain some brownie points. Ladies and gentlemen, let us tell you why that model does not have any proof that NGOs in fact are better than international organizations, and why they have not proved this burden that was on them. Ladies and gentlemen, sustainable development must always start with short-term, ladies and gentlemen. Long-term change starts with immediate change, ladies and gentlemen. And when you don't have short-term change happening, if today you do not stop a conflict, that you cannot say that in the long term this conflict will stop, ladies and gentlemen. The first step that these international organizations do is have ceasefires, is give humanitarian aid, is give food, and essentially, side government would like you to believe that organizations such as the World Health Organization that set up clinics, etc., in villages and so on and so forth, train people as doctors, train people to give vaccines and so on and so forth, are not apparently helping locals and helping NGOs, ladies and gentlemen. That is absolutely ludicrous. Now to go on to this part where the skills are not distributed, ladies and gentlemen, we've already told you that when these organizations do work with local NGOs, they do give them certain expertise that they will not be exposed to otherwise, ladies and gentlemen. Small NGOs in Somalian villages will not have expertise of logistics, distribution channels, and cost efficiency, ladies and gentlemen, that the United Nations or the African Mission in Somalia by the African Union can provide, ladies and gentlemen. Side opposition gave very, very valid points on why international organizations have succeeded in the past and why they have continued to succeed. The country of Afghanistan had its first democratic election in 60 years simply because of something called the UNAMA, which is the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, which is essentially a development mission which helped the local government be formed, ladies and gentlemen. So if you're talking about long-term growth, what is more long-term than having a democratic government after 60 years? The UNOCI in Côte d'Ivoire, or the United Nations operation in Côte d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast, stopped a decade-long civil war. What is better for the long term than stopping a war that has been going on for as long as one can remember, ladies and gentlemen? You speak of grassroots connect and you speak of connecting to the locals, but you forget that these grassroots connects are sometimes extremely inefficient, and they need this amount of inefficiency simply because one, you ask for an exceptional system of checks and balances to be placed, which essentially increases the cost and the work involved in it. So you're telling me not only are we giving them the aid, we also now have to set up an additional system where these people are kept in check. Isn't that just extra work and another step in the ladder, in the hierarchy, ladies and gentlemen? Secondly, not all NGOs and other organizations in war-torn and conflict-ridden areas are open to audits and financial checks, ladies and gentlemen. So we do not know whether the money that is given to them, whether the resources that are given to them are being auctioned off by them, sold by them, or used by them, or kept by them, ladies and gentlemen. So we do not know where this money is going because there is no fair audits happening in these regions.
Ladies and gentlemen, international agencies or international organizations do possess technological and other resources that help secure the aid to the end point, ladies and gentlemen, which does not happen. We've seen cases where the Al-Shabaab, a pirate organization in Somalia, has seized aid from local NGOs, as stated by the deputy leader of opposition, ladies and gentlemen. This also, you're taking the risk that is involved in dealing with extremist organizations that the United Nations and other blue helmets and so on and so forth is specifically meant to deal with, and you're transferring that risk to people who are not equipped, trained, or otherwise to deal with, ladies and gentlemen. We're not saying we're not enabling the local NGOs. We absolutely are. But you're sending the local NGOs into a gunfire without any training. You're essentially sending a man with a knife to a gunfight, ladies and gentlemen. And that is absolutely not good for either of the three stakeholders that we mentioned, and that may be the international organization, whether it be the local NGOs, or whether it be the people who need to receive that aid in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why side opposition takes this argument every day of the week and twice on a Sunday, ladies and gentlemen. We take your POI now.
So when agencies leave and leave these underdeveloped NGOs, they talk about how so these international agencies leave these countries and leave these underdeveloped NGOs. How these local NGOs actually develop these countries?
Fantastic question. So we've tried explaining that, but it seems like you weren't paying much attention since you were speaking amongst yourself, but that's fair. Ladies and gentlemen, when we have these local NGOs leave countries post-conflict, ladies and gentlemen, there are mechanisms set up by these local NGOs. For example, the UNAMA, as we mentioned in Afghanistan, has an exiting process where they leave in parts. So when they leave in these parts, they inculcate these programs that are given to local and self-governments, ladies and gentlemen. So essentially, it is not one-day conflict over, we're up and leaving, ladies and gentlemen. It is essentially a process where it is done in a structural manner, which essentially is better for long-term growth, because not only are you solving the short-term conflict, you are also preventing future conflict, ladies and gentlemen, by providing more stability and by providing more expertise that is available to larger international organizations. Let's not fool ourselves and tell us that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is not important when it comes to refugee situations. Let's not fool ourselves and tell us the United Nations Human Rights Council is not important for humanitarian aid. Let's not fool ourselves and tell us that the SPECPOL is not important for the Israel-Palestine issue, ladies and gentlemen, because these international organizations and these diplomatic ties are. And ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to conclude with a very simple argument that we proposed from the very beginning, that side proposition has no answer to, and ladies and gentlemen, and that is that the aid channels have loopholes in their distribution. There is disrupting of the aid in itself when it comes to securitization. There is no obligation that is completed on the ground, and there have been times when their obligations have not been met, ladies and gentlemen. There is no regulation and enforcement mechanisms in place for NGOs, and that is why side opposition takes this argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming today. And now I invite you all to like.
Alright, so we've seen two very well-constructed narratives through the course of the debate. However, the opposition narrative is one that survived all the jabs and survived the test of loopholes. I'll tell you why. So side governance narrative goes along the lines of this: that NGOs and independent bodies, they do not need the expertise of international organizations. They can do everything by themselves. And international organizations are corrupt and won't let us rise in the ranks and won't let us all the shots go to upper management positions. And that's a narrative that's very myopic in the sense that it does not provide overall development, sustainable development that they talk about. Under our narrative, we talked about how international organizations that have an organized manner of working, that have a framework, that have a structure, that have proved paths of resource distribution and food chain supply distribution, which has been so efficient in the past. When NGOs work with them, they leverage this expertise of them. They also leverage the military might that they may have to go into certain disturbed regions. We tell you that the government had two problems with our narrative, and those two problems do not stand at the end of this debate. The first problem they had with our narrative was that they felt our narrative was not sustainable. We tell you this. We've proved time and again through the course of the debate that once these NGOs work with international organizations, they do gain a certain level of expertise, after which they can call the shots, they do run the country, they do run the entire mission within the nation, they do whatever, they take whatever grassroots level decisions that they do want at the end of the day. We tell you that the need of the hour is efficient distribution of resources. The side government is willing to make this trade-off that we are willing, side government said we are willing to make this trade-off, that we let go of efficiency in exchange of local self-governance. We tell you on the other hand that what the need of the hour is in such a situation is quick sustainability and efficient sustainability. We do not believe that the lack of resources is justified inside government. Under our model, we provide not only a sustainable model, but our paradigm also has quicker and more efficient solutions to it. They also talked about how there were also a few points that went completely uncontested from side government. We talked about how there is a large transfer of risk to NGOs and how these NGOs need to be protected because they too are a part of the local community. Side government had no answer to that. We talked about how there are lack of infrastructure and mechanisms under which these NGOs can operate. We told you how in these regions NGOs do not have a framework. They do not have an organized manner to operate, because of which resources will literally be wasted, will literally go down the drain. Again, side proposition had no argument for that. We also talked about our very robust mechanism where NGOs and international organizations work hand in hand, and why it is more beneficial to give the aid to the international organizations indeed, because they're more accountable, because they know how to use their funds well, because they have expertise that can actually tell you where to direct the funds. This was our model, and proposition could not find any loopholes in it so far. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you this. We tell you that if you give a man a fish, he feeds himself for one day. But if you teach him how to fish, well, he feeds himself for a lifetime, right? And that's essentially what side opposition model is all about. We tell you that we can actually create a situation working with local NGOs, reaching the grassroots levels through the NGOs, which is a mutually beneficial relationship between the two. On the other hand, side government's model is very myopic in this sense, because they talk about how NGOs would be much better at dealing with the situation, which is of a magnitude which is much out of their control. We also talked about various other factors. We told you about how non-deliverance of aid is a very big possibility on their part. We told you how there is a transfer of risk to NGOs in their model. We told you how international organizations have done their job successfully under our model. We told you how we might be creating a problem that does not exist today by actually giving money into the hands of unaccounted, unaudited individuals. With all these points into place, very proud to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mr. Because when the debate, that is when government lies. Okay.
This debate became confusing to judge because both sides were debating on different premises. They were completely different. However, the question becomes, which is the more viable premise in which this debate can exist? Because opposition wants to talk about war-torn countries, which are obviously, with a lot of situations, don't have NGOs in them because a lot of people are dead. But also, we think that it makes more sense that it's put in countries like Philippines or Cambodia, where it's not necessarily war-torn, but their economy hasn't been thriving, and that's why we give them development aid. Because a lot of the aid that opposition wanted to talk about were like UNAMA, we think that all those things are important, but they're crisis control aid, right? Or overcoming those particular wars and overcoming those crises. We're fine with that. We've even tried to engage with the premise, saying that if these countries had NGOs, and they needed, and they weren't like militarily equipped, we will be fine with the UN Blue Hats coming in and securitizing them and protecting them, because the UN Blue Hats are not a developmental aid organization. They're more of a military or a security organization. Yeah, that's when they've already went out of this particular debate. But what were the issues that they had with our case? They said that we had problem with distribution. We've told you why the distribution in our world will be better when you focus on issues that actually matter to the people on the ground. Yeah, these are the most important stakeholders, right? And we've told you that the reason why the international bodies won't do that is because they told us that they will be more accountable. Maybe. But who are they accountable to? We don't think that the international bodies, their interests are to the people on the ground. Their interests are more towards their reputation, or more towards that state government. And that's when they fail to analyze or fail to target specific problems. We've told you that in our world, local NGOs are more efficient or more effective in that because they live in those communities. They know what's needed there. Because they have a positive interest within those communities themselves. Because the exclusive benefit from our world is that particular proximity in which they don't get in their world as well. And we don't think that proximity was ever tackled coming from opposition bench. Second problem that they had with our case was about the framework, right? So we told you that in our world, it's not that these NGOs are entirely bad, because these countries like, for example, Philippines and Cambodia, and like a lot of countries which have some sort of democracy or have some sort of development, however, they need help in going further, right? So they need help in going further. So given that, we've told you that the NGOs do have ambitions, and the NGOs do have goals in which they want to achieve. However, the reason why opposition tells you that they fail, the opposition tells you that they fail, but the reason why they fail is that they don't have the resources in order to carry out their aspirations. We tell you that the reason why they don't have those resources is that because these resources are being funneled into international communities which don't deal with the grassroots issues in the first place. So we told you that when we give these resources to these NGOs, that's when you can better develop the nation, and not only infrastructure-wise, but also develop them as human beings and develop them as people, and we think that that's more important as well. So, and that's more important. So, in order for you to judge this video, you have to take a step back and really analyze what's important and what really matters to the specific nuance of this motion. We've told you that what matters is dealing with the real issues and being able to sustain that particular development, or just not only just having hospitals and schools, but being able to fill them with qualified individuals in which we are able to educate through our local NGOs, right? And we think that that's an exclusive benefit which opposition has failed, to tackle. Sure, we think that we've already conceded from the get-go that the trade-off that we have is that it may be slower, or they may not have that expertise. But the expertise that in which opposition wants to say that gets to these local NGOs assumes that it trickles down. We've told you why it won't trickle down, because they'll only get the lower positions and won't be involved in calling the shots. We need these NGOs to call the shots. We need to give them resources in order to solve the issue.
Thank you very much all for the big round for us, big hands, and give us 10 minutes to let us off. Thank you.